Good evening, everyone, and welcome to week 3 of Great Decisions 2025, which, as it turns out, is the 19th consecutive year, not the 18th consecutive year. Thank you so much for braving the cold and making it out tonight. Before we get started, as always, I'd love to thank the sponsors of the series. So, without further ado, and I say it often enough, if you'd like to say it along with me, please feel free. The League of Women Voters of Manitowoc County, the Manitowoc Public Library Foundation, the Manitowoc Public Library, and the Lakeshore Unitarian Universalist Fellowship. So a big round of applause for our sponsors. Before we get started tonight, just a few quick announcements. Don't forget that if you're interested in the companion publication, that can be purchased at the main desk for $15. It gives a great overview and introduction to the lectures that are given. And since we're still at week 3, $15 is a great price. Also, just so you're aware of it, the Murder Mystery at Manitowoc Public Library, the foundation fundraiser that is coming up in April, the tickets are on sale now, either at the front desk or online. So if you just go to our website, you can get all the information, and I won't take up any of your time with saying that now. So I'd like to introduce our speaker tonight, who is Martin F. Farrell, PhD. Marty Farrell recently retired after 44 years of college and university teaching political science and international relations, the last 40 at Ripon College. He is the author of over 70 peer-reviewed articles, book chapters, and conference papers. He led students on 10 study abroad experiences, beginning with China in 1981, and also including Russia, Eastern Europe, and Italy. His own travel and research has taken him to 47 countries on 6 continents. He also recently retired from elective office after 28 years on the Fond du Lac County Board of Supervisors, the last 16 as chair. He continues to do independent research and make public presentations, such as tonight. And he is the only Great Decisions speaker to have appeared at all 19 seasons. So, Martin Farrell, everyone.
Thank you very much, Tim, and thank you to the sponsors of the series. Thank you for that nice welcome, all of you, and braving very intemperate temperatures, if I could say that. Appreciate your coming out tonight. I think I'll start. I usually try to start with a humorous story of some sort. Don't always succeed, but tonight it's kind of hard for me because as the author of the article in the booklet, if you've had a chance to look at that yet, starts off her article by saying Europe is frightened and frightening for the first time in decades. And I can't disagree with that. And I'm not here to scare you, but I am very worried. And what I'm worried about is World War III. And again, I'm not here to be a fearmonger or to stir up unnecessary anxiety. We probably all have enough of that as it is. But I thank the League of Women Voters for taking some of that off my mind by putting me up here overnight tonight. So I didn't have to drive back to Ripon in the dark, in my rather obsolete vehicle in this temperature. So thank you for that. That relieved my anxiety. But we have a lot of anxiety, and the events are breaking daily on this. And I try to be as up to date as possible. Also, I am not here to pick on any individuals, present or not present. I'm not here to demonize anyone or anything, but I'm here to help you think these things through. And I'm going to go through some slides. Some of them I'm going to go through pretty rapidly because I want to have plenty of time for questions and discussion. This is a real turning point for the United States. We've been this stalwart backer of NATO for 70 years. And now that's being called into serious question really for the first time. And you're citizens, and you're the ones that should be participating in deciding what we do as a nation. So I want to hear your ideas and hear what you have to think about what direction we should go in. Now, I spoke on this a pretty closely related topic last year, so I don't want to repeat too much, but we do need a little background. So let's go back to the formation of NATO, which basically happened essentially because at the end of World War II, maybe, can you see my cursor on there? No, that's a different, I guess that's a different, okay, but see here, Stalingrad, right here, okay, on the far right-hand side. That was one of the biggest battles on the Eastern Front in World War II. There's a good movie that actually depicts that very accurately. It's called Enemy at the Gates, if you've seen that. Having been in what is now called Volgograd myself, I can tell you it's a very accurate portrayal of that city and what it must have gone through at this time. It's basically totally destroyed. But the Red Army did emerge victorious and chased the Wehrmacht of Germany out. Then had another big battle at Kursk, which destroyed unknown 20,000 German tanks, with the upshot that the Red Army is advancing in through Eastern Europe very rapidly in 1943, 1944. Given that, in October 1944, Winston Churchill and Joseph Stalin met in Moscow and discussed possible spheres of influence in Central and Eastern Europe following the war. And you see on the upper level, that's actually the notes Churchill took. And he sketched out the name of the country, which is summarized below, easier to read. But the country and the amount of influence the Western countries would have versus the Soviet Union. And you can see that in Bulgaria, the Soviet Union was going to have 75 to 80%, but in Greece, the West was going to have 90% influence. Hungary, somewhere between 50 and 80%. Soviet, Romania, 90 to 100%. Yugoslavia was to be split 50-50. Now, again, this was called the naughty document because they weren't supposed to be dividing Europe up like this. But Churchill felt it was realistic to do this. And Roosevelt is said to have tentatively agreed after the fact, even though he wasn't happy with it because of the spheres of influence idea. But here's the disposition of troops on VE Day, and you can easily see all the red flags are the Soviet troops. They're dominating all of Eastern Europe right up to Berlin. And so, you know, really, what could we do about that? Despite some assurances of the right of national self-determination and holding free elections that Stalin agreed to, in the end, the Soviet Union ended up controlling a great deal of Eastern Europe, especially. But he did live up to his word. He did not try to take Greece. There was a civil war in Greece, which he told the Yugoslavs to, Tito, the leader there, shut that down. Also, there was communist activity in Turkey, which Stalin said, bank that. We agreed not to do that. Also, you may not remember, but Austria was occupied, the eastern half, by the Soviet Union until 1955, at which time they withdrew. And they didn't try to keep half of Austria, but with the stipulation, which is still holding true today, that Austria would be neutral and would not join NATO or another Western alliance. But I'm going to dwell on this slide just a little bit more because it's very important to understand the changes in borders that took place. So again, the darkest red is the Soviet Union in 1938. In this, I have to take a look here. These two shades of red aren't very well distinguished, are they, on this slide? They're better in the original photograph. See, these are new lands that the Soviet Union got from Poland, which they put into the Ukraine SSR. And part of Poland they put into the Belarusian, now we call Belarus, Byelorussian, and also now the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, were incorporated into the Soviet Union, much to their chagrin and anger. And this little one, that's Kaliningrad. That's formerly Germany. That's where Immanuel Kant lived and wrote. I'm going to come to the other side of the room in a minute. See what it says? You can't see, I'm sorry. RSFSR. That was made part of Russia, not even part of Lithuania or the Byelorussian SSR, but was actually part of Russia, which it is to this day. So, these borders are very important. Here it's a little bit clearer to see the lighter red were added to the Soviet Union. Now, in exchange, Poland got part of Germany. And part of, this was also East Prussia, part of East Prussia. And there were other changes down here in Istria. That was the area of Trieste. And a few others. But the other reason this is important is that in order to avoid World War III repeating what we'd already seen in World War I and World War II, these borders have to be respected. And again, there were changes. You could see that. And if you look at earlier maps of Europe, you can see there's all kinds of border changes. And there's all kinds of irredentism. For instance, Hungary. There's tons of Hungarians living in northern Yugoslavia and western Romania. And Hungary used to be a much bigger country. But if Hungary decides we're going to invade Romania and take back lands we used to have, that could be a trigger for another war, just like we had in World War I and World War II. So respect for these boundaries is essential. And this is when I worry, when we have leaders like Putin, and unfortunately, perhaps others, told you I wasn't going to pick on anybody, that don't respect these borders and either use violence in the case of Putin to try to change them or to threaten the use of force to change them. That's equally forbidden by the NATO treaty as well. In the case of Putin, what he's violating is the Budapest Memorandum of 1994, in which Russia solemnly pledged to refrain from threatening or using military force or economic coercion against Ukraine, Belarus, and Kazakhstan. And the special significance there was those were three of the Russian federated socialist republics that had nuclear weapons. And when they agreed to give up their nuclear weapons and join the non-proliferation regime, this was the security assurance that they were given in exchange. We don't have nuclear weapons anymore to deter an attack, so we need your solemn promise you won't attack us. And he blatantly violated it. So that's why these boundaries are extremely important. The incredible destruction of World War II, it's hard, I know we've all seen the pictures, but it's unbelievable. And it's so much easier to destroy than to build up. And we've seen it in Ukraine. Another issue that I'd like to get to if we have time, even if we are able to end this horrible conflict, how are we going to rebuild? Ukraine. Ukraine is not a rich country. It has potential, especially in agriculture, but the industry that it inherited was Soviet Union type industry, which wasn't the greatest, if you remember that. So they have struggled economically, they've struggled politically. But here's another thing. There is a lot of money in this world, and there are outside investors who, with the proper incentives, could invest in rebuilding Ukraine. But who's going to invest in Ukraine if within 2, 3, 4 years, there's another invasion? And if they're not part of NATO, which we're being told they can't be, what's the guarantee that they'll be secure? It's only with NATO's protection that Putin wouldn't or couldn't repeat breaking the solemn pledges that his country already made once again. Okay. See, again, the idea was after World War II, as the slide shows. And by the way, I was in Germany quite a few times. And even in West Germany, there was so much destruction that they were just sorting bricks and rubble for 15 years. Until 1960. They had trying to rebuild factories, everything, housing. The men were trying to work if they could find jobs. Frankly, a lot of the women at the time and elderly people were just out in the rubble fields sorting bricks. Good brick, bad brick, good brick, bad brick, and then take the good bricks and rebuild. That went on for 15 years. No one has ever caused the amount of death and destruction to any country, but certainly not Germany, than Adolf Hitler. He is the one, his actions produced this tremendous destruction. But the failures, the leaders that said, of Europe said after the war, never again. We've had it twice now. Just can't do it again. Why did it happen? We failed to sustain the democracy of the Weimar Republic. We tried to appease Hitler, it didn't work. We gave him concessions like the Sudetenland in Czechoslovakia and other areas that we said, okay, all right, just be nice now. You can have that piece. Don't take any more. He wanted it all. And economic nationalism failed. High tariffs. These were called the Smoot-Hawley tariffs in the United States. They were a disaster. They made the Depression worse. So these were the three big mistakes that led to this disaster. In order to prevent it, we're going to have to be more interdependent. Some of the leaders, even including Winston Churchill, even spoke of the need for a United States of Europe. So appeasing Hitler didn't work. So I'll pose a question even right now at the beginning. Is the West now appeasing Vladimir Putin?
Yes.
Because it's not just the most recent 2022 full-scale invasion of Ukraine. If you go back to 2008, he invaded Georgia on the southern border near the Caucasus and has subsequently occupied provinces of South Ossetia and Abkhazia in the country of Georgia. In 2014, he invaded Ukraine and annexed Crimea and simultaneously infiltrated and destabilized the Donbass region and provinces of Luhansk and Donetsk. And that's where the fighting is mainly going on right now. And he called this area Novorossiya, New Russia. In 2022, the Council of Europe declared the Moldovan territory of Transnistria as having been under Russian military occupation. So this is a small area on the eastern border of Moldova. It's right borders on Ukraine, by the way. So that's another little slice that he has taken. And now the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, intended to topple its democratically elected government and turn it into a puppet state. That was the original plan. Now, we have put sanctions on them. This is before 2022. So because of the 2014 invasion and annexation of Crimea, and then malicious cyber activities, coercive use of energy. So these were all the sanctions put on before 2022, but they obviously didn't stop him. Later we'll see what the effect of the current sanctions are, which have been multiplied a lot. But they do have an impact. I'll just say right now, it's probably estimated that it's costing the average Russian about 7 to 8% of their disposable income, the impact of the sanctions. But again, they aren't rebelling, apparently, because for one thing, they can't. It's a dictatorship. And we've seen how many people who have opposed Putin have been murdered, poisoned, died in prison. Completely controls the media. Any opposition is labeled unpatriotic, traitorous, and put down. So even though it's costing the Russian people, there isn't really much they can do about it. Back to the NATO formation, just for a moment. This went hand in hand with the Marshall Plan, which at the time was 173 billion in today's dollars. So that's a significant amount. That's more than what we have extended to Ukraine, for example, today, in comparable dollar terms. This was economic aid to rebuild the economies of 18 countries. And you can see some of it was in kind. So this would be on sacks of grain. This would be on other food items that it came from the United States. Was this foreign aid? Yes, this was foreign aid. Was this charity? Well, in part it was charity in the sense that many people were actually starving, because not only had the cities been bombed, not only had the factories been bombed, but even the farmland had been destroyed by bombing, by mines, by tank battles. So believe me, they're really hurting. If you want to see this in a movie, The Bicycle Thief by Vittorio De Sica, made in 1948, the Italian people are struggling so mightily. They're pawning their bed linens just to get a sack of flour to try to make a little pasta. They are suffering. And meanwhile, who's taking advantage of this? The Italian Communist Party. Because they're saying capitalism has failed you and it's continuing to fail you. The war's been over for 2 or 3 years and you still have nothing. We need communism. And they were voting 25-30% for the Communist Party. So it was foreign aid and it was charity. But it was also enlightened self-interest, because we knew, A, if they are continuing to wallow in misery, bad things are going to happen politically. And also economically, we were afraid that our own economy would slip back into depression after the wartime stimulation was over. We needed customers. And people can't be your customers if they have no money. And this is still true today. This idea that if my neighbor is poor, and if I can, somehow squeeze as much as I possibly can out of him, then I'll be better off, is simply not true. If my neighbor is better off, then that can make me better off too, because if I'm a barber, he'll get more haircuts. If I have a sandwich shop, they'll buy more sandwiches. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. There is such a thing as a win-win situation. And the American Congress at that time, it needed bipartisan support for these initiatives. And one of the biggest one was called the Vandenberg Act, of 1948. And that's named after Arthur Vandenberg, Republican senator of California. And you may also remember that before World War II, there was a lot of isolationism in the United States. Don't get involved. It doesn't affect us. It doesn't, we don't need to get involved in World War II. Obviously, Pearl Harbor squelched that line of thinking. But after the war, there was a recognition by both Republicans and Democrats that Vandenberg resolution passed 83-15. So that shows you the consensus that the Marshall Plan, NATO cooperation to prevent this happening again was important. Okay, I'm not going to go over this in detail, but there's a lot going on at this time. Truman Doctrine, Marshall Plan, Berlin blockade, you may remember, for over a year that we used the flights to land at Tempelhof Airport in Berlin and bring them supplies. NATO treaty signed 1949. Soviet nuclear test. Communist takeover China. Korean War. Korean War changed a lot of thinking. I think before then, again, we would have tried to avoid putting our troops abroad. But with Korea, it was seen, at least decided, that it was necessary, that we had to intervene. And so that kind of changed the thinking in Washington in regard to putting troops abroad. So NATO was signed in 1949 with 12 original members on the left-hand side. Then in response, the Warsaw Pact of Soviet Union was formed in May of 1955. So those are obviously the red countries there. But this again, was called the Iron Curtain, but it also did demarcate areas where things were handled differently depending on where they took place. So for example, NATO was standing strong that if the Soviet Union took a step into any of the NATO members, and Germany had joined by this time, as you can see there, that would be war. But on the other hand, if it's not in a NATO member, that is in your own so-called satellite country, we, the West, are going to largely keep hands off of that. Because otherwise, again, we could easily escalate into World War III, and this time with nuclear weapons. So East Germany had an uprising in the mid-50s. Hungary, of course, in 1956. And Czechoslovakia in 1968, the Prague Spring. The Soviets did send in their own troops and other Warsaw Pact troops and put those down, and we more or less tolerated it. Why? Because, again, what could we have done without starting a full-scale war? And I know there were always the advocates of rollback, roll the Soviet Union back. Don't just contain them. What we're doing here is containing them in their own area. Why not roll back? Because again, it would have meant World War III with nuclear weapons. And we just weren't prepared for that. Okay, now NATO has since expanded, now even added recently Finland and Sweden. And we have some affiliated organizations as well. But mainly it's North America, the United States and Canada, plus Western Europe, but also Turkey. And you can see, again, we don't have really time to go over this, but we did add other members in the 1990s, former communist countries like Czech Republic, Hungary, Poland, and then in the 2000s, even more. And 2009, Albania, and Croatia, and a few more since then. So that is an issue. Well, I'll come back to that in a moment. What were the purposes of NATO? and through the Cold War era, deter further expansion of the Soviet control, prevent a revival of nationalist militarism in Europe, in other words, fascism, Nazism, and encourage European political and economic integration. This was the first external defense commitment that we ever made outside of our own borders. And the keystone of the deterrence was the U.S. nuclear arsenal. In other words, if the Soviet Union had decided to invade Western Europe, we would not have been able to stop them with conventional forces. Just didn't have enough. But the nuclear threat was the ultimate deterrent. That if you invade, first of all, we will stop you. And then if you try to keep going, then we will escalate to a nuclear weapon. And again, this is so very important. I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in a minute. But the NATO treaty was enmeshed within the United Nations framework. One member, Portugal, was a dictatorship at the time, but they were vital. We needed the Azores Islands out in the Atlantic for refueling and that of our ships, airplanes. So we made a compromise with their government at that time. Main provisions, obviously you don't have time to go through all this, but the most important one is Article 5. And I do want to point out a couple of things. That's the famous article that an attack on one member is an attack on all. However, if you'll note, it doesn't absolutely commit all the countries to a full-out declaration of war response. It does not. It says if one of our members is attacked, the other members will take forthwith, individually and in concert with the other parties, such action as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force, to restore and maintain the security of the North Atlantic area. So in other words, it's still up to the member country to decide exactly how they will respond. They're not committed to an all-out total war response. And the only time this article has been invoked in the entire history, going back to 1949, was after the September 11th attacks in the United States. NATO members at that time agreed to invoke Article 5. Now, what did that mean, though? What it meant was that virtually all of them did commit troops to Afghanistan, because that was our first response. The United States went into Afghanistan to try to find Osama bin Laden and to root out the government that had been harboring him and so forth. And the NATO members did send troops there. And they served the whole time in many cases. Now, they could qualify exactly how their troops served, though. And that was still consistent, as it says, take such action as it deems necessary. But I have statistics later. I don't know if we'll have time to get to it, but in that detail. But about 1,200 NATO soldiers did lose their lives in Afghanistan. And that's about half of what the United States lost. So yes, we lost more in Afghanistan, but they lost a goodly number, over 1,200. And if you take individual countries like Denmark, their death toll in Afghanistan was actually a higher percentage of their population than the 2,400 that we lost. So they did make a sacrifice. And yet, unfortunately, we have people who think the NATO partners have just been free riders, freeloaders, not doing anything. When we were viciously attacked in 2001, they did respond, and they gave up their lives in the cause that we asked them to at that time. Back to 1995. Now the Soviet Union is kaput. And we had a lot of high hopes for this era. And we did cut our military budget. The US cut ours 15%, and a number of the European allies also cut theirs. But we also had to consider NATO expansion. And we knew Russia was against it, but Putin wasn't in power yet at this time. If you remember, 1995 was B. Yeltsin. And we knew there were some pros and cons to it, but we thought overall NATO expansion would improve stability and security in important ways. And NATO would have an open door policy. That means if a country wants to join, we'll let them join. And why isn't it up to them and their democratic processes to decide what organizations they want to belong to? You know, myself at the time, and I know there are some scholars that don't agree with the NATO expansion, that it might have provoked Russia ultimately. And I felt at the time myself, you know, I don't know if we really need to rush this right now. But because Russia was weak, again, I hope you don't mind a few little stories, and I may have told this even last year, so I'm sorry. But I was in former East Germany several times in the early 90s. And I remember 1991, 1992, I was with a friend taking a bicycle ride out into the countryside, and we stopped at a little tavern to get, yes, a beer. I was of age. And we were approached in the tavern, or Bierstube, by Russian soldiers. And they're trying to sell us everything. So, you know, former Soviet soldiers. They're trying to sell us parts of their uniform. And one of them actually said, "How about hand grenades? $5 each." I am not lying. He was offering to sell hand grenades. Yeah, believe me. I know nothing. I did not serve. I don't know anything about hand grenades. But we didn't buy them. But the Russian army was obviously virtually almost non-existent at that time. So I'm thinking, why rush? They can't do anything now if they want to. But you know who wanted to rush? These other countries. Romania, Hungary, Czech Republic. They split up around a little bit later, 1995. At the time, it was still Czechoslovakia. Poland. They wanted to join. Why? Because we want to join now and make sure that we have this protection. Because we don't know. At that time, there was still rumblings that maybe the Communist Party would make a comeback in Russia. And it turned out that isn't what happened. But what happened is the ultra-right-wing, ultra-nationalists, who I also met in Moscow in 1995. We had a press conference. A bunch of us American scholars were on an academic tour there. And we had a press conference with members of all the Russian political parties. And they were arranged from left to right. Former communists here, ultra-nationalists, people like Zhirinovsky over here. And I'll never forget, after the question and answer and the discussion, some of the far right ones came right up to us Americans and said, "We're going to get you. It's just a matter of time. We'll be Rome and you'll be Carthage." That is literally what they said to us. So that we see that kind of behavior now isn't totally surprising, because the center never really solidified in Russia. They tried through the 90s, but ultimately they didn't build up enough strength. And now we have Putin on the ultra-nationalist side. So these are the requirements to join NATO, and that remains true to this day. And we added Sweden and Finland just in the last 2 years. Not really going to go over the structure too much, but there is a council. Again, decisions of NATO have to be made by consensus. So everybody has to more or less agree of what they're going to do. And they have done other things with troops other than Afghanistan. They didn't before 2000, at least before during the Cold War period, but subsequently they have. And you've heard of the Supreme Allied Commander, Atlantic and Europe. Secretary General is Mark Rutte today, former Prime Minister of the Netherlands. Now, we've also heard, complaints about these countries not paying their way. Now, NATO has two different budgets. So the operational budget, the so-called common charges, this covers about 2,000 day-to-day staff. They have 5 AWACS aircraft, number of drones. That was 2.7 billion last year. But it's divided according to GDP, except the US pays only the same amount as Germany, 16.3%, although our economy is more than 3 times bigger than Germany's. Now, who's taking advantage of whom in this particular instance? And the rest are all proportional to their GDP. Now, it is also true that when it comes to mission deployment, each member decides its own contribution and pays for it. So we had many more troops in Afghanistan than anybody else, 68,000 at the high point, I guess. It cost us $3.6 billion a month that year. But the other countries didn't have to obviously match that. They put in the number of soldiers they thought they could afford and paid for them. So that's how these things are basically funded. But then there's the other provision in 2006, members committed to spend at least 2% of GDP on their own defense budget. And again, at the end of last year, 23 of the 32 have met that target. So there's 9 that still haven't. But again, that's them spending on their own military. That is not money they owe the NATO headquarters. Nobody is in arrears on that. That is all paid up every year. But there are some countries that haven't reached the 2% goal. But that's not money that they owe us. That's just money they have to convince their own people to spend on their own military. And they haven't quite done it yet. But they don't owe that to us. They are not in debt to us. And again, some people claim that they are. Another claim that I heard was that any country that's not meeting the 2%, that's a tax on the United States. A tax. No, it isn't. They're not taking anything from us, and nobody's telling us how much to spend on our military, but our own people. That's our own Congress. And if we don't, we're spending over 3.5%, I believe. But if that's what we want to spend, that's our decision. Yes, it's more than 2%, but Poland is way more than 2%. But we also have global responsibilities, or at least we have up till now. That may be changing. But again, these are some of the myths that are put out there regarding NATO and funding. Again, we don't have all night to go through all of this, but as you can see, most of the countries, most of the members have reached the 2%. And then recently, President Trump said, no, it should be 5%. Okay, again, I understand that from his point of view, this is trying to drive a better bargain. But on the other hand, we don't spend 5%. We're not even close. And that would be a big commitment. But it may happen. It may happen whether he's asked for it or not. And the main reason it may happen is if the European members decide they cannot count on the United States anymore, they are going to have to increase their defense spending very significantly. And the real question, one real question is, can they do it fast enough to continue to deter an attack? Also, there's a certain amount they're supposed to spend on equipment as opposed to personnel. Most of them have met that, except just 2. Now, it is true that the United States, and this is important, is the biggest contributor to defense expenditures of NATO. So we are spending, as of last year, $755 billion, the rest $430. So that is undeniably the case. But we're also the biggest country, the biggest economy, and worldwide interests. But now if we look just at Canada and Europe, excluding the United States, we see it's really been going up. And in part it's because of the new members. Finland and Sweden both have very decent sized and capable militaries. So at least it has been going up. So I think that's important to keep in mind. Now, who can afford to spend more? This one shows us the percentage of GDP paid in taxes. And we see the United States is near the bottom. This isn't just NATO, this is the OECD, which is the most highly developed economies in the world. You can see that there's only a handful who are actually extracting less as a percentage of GDP in overall, this is total taxes, total tax revenue. We're way down at the bottom. Yet, again, we constantly hear we can't afford anything. And frankly, we're now taking a sledgehammer and a meat axe simultaneously to our entire federal government because our taxes are too high. Well, again, compared to what? That would be a question. Again, I'm just going to mention one thing here, and we'll get to the discussion actually fairly soon. The main purpose of NATO is to deter aggression. And let's think for a moment, what does that require? What do we mean by deter? We mean prevent somebody from doing something. So how do we prevent somebody from invading another country? By threatening them with unacceptable losses if they do it. That's what it's been about. It hasn't been about winning World War III, it's been about deterring and preventing World War III. Because we don't want to, again, we beat Hitler, we beat Mussolini, but look at the cost. Unbelievable. And I haven't even mentioned the 70 million people that were killed. The destruction. We want to avoid that. So I'd rather deter the war if I'm not giving away the farm. And appeasement is not part of deterrence. No, deterrence means you don't cross this line, because if you do, the price you will pay will be unacceptable to you. And you have to believe it too. I have to not only say it, I have to convince you that I mean it. And that isn't always easy. But that's the main purpose of this. And again, NATO has done other things, but estimated war deaths in Afghanistan, again, the Afghans obviously paid the biggest price, both Taliban and government, but also humanitarian aid workers lost some, but civilians, 71,000. Terrible. But the U.S. military is just a little bit over here compared to that. I'm not in any way diminishing the sacrifice that our brave men and women did over there. And I pay tribute to them for doing what they did and doing it the best they could under very difficult circumstances. But also it's kind of interesting, U.S. contractors had more deaths than our actual personnel. Almost 4,000 compared to 2,448. But other Allied troops, over 1,100. So they did sacrifice lives, our NATO allies. Again, we have other current operations. Again, these are not combat for the most part, but they actually are in Iraq. They weren't fighting. They went in after the U.S. withdrew from Iraq as kind of peacekeepers trying to help with rebuilding the country. We're also peacemakers in Kosovo, in the Mediterranean Ocean, a couple places in Africa, and a few others. So there are a few other activities of NATO. Okay, Russia versus NATO. There is no doubt in my mind, or very little anyway, that if it really comes down to an actual war, NATO versus Russia, NATO will win. But I would rather not do it. Because it could easily, if it looks like Russia's losing, then there's the escalation to nuclear possibility. So we don't know what would happen. But if you look at the personnel, if you can read it, NATO has almost 6 million soldiers in uniform to only 1.3 million for Russia. Tanks are about equal, although this doesn't count how many Russian tanks have been destroyed in Ukraine. We'll look at that in a minute. We have 5 times as many armored vehicles, 3 times as many ships, 16 times as many aircraft carriers, and a lot more airplanes. So I don't think there's any question in a complete total showdown, NATO would win. But even without the United States, and here's the combined military spending of NATO versus Russia on the top one. That's our NATO's total military spending. Yeah, some people haven't hit 2%, but still, I mean, good Lord, look at that. It's not even close. Now, this down here is actually mislabeled, but not by me, but this is NATO defense spending without the United States if they were spending the 2%. And this is what it is now without the 2%. Even without the 2%, Canada and Europe alone spend almost twice as much as Russia. So it's kind of a mismatch. It also shows you that Europe and Canada might be able to go it alone without the United States if we really don't want to participate anymore. But the 2 nuclear arsenals, again, US and Russia are by far the most. But France and the United Kingdom, have about 425 total together. Now, what about aid to Ukraine? Again, we've heard that the Europeans aren't doing their share. But in fact, if you actually look at it, and it takes into account all forms, military aid, financial aid, and humanitarian aid, yes, the United States has contributed more than any individual other entity. But if you take the EU institutions and these other countries and add them up, it's actually more. So now, admittedly, Japan is in there, and let's see, I think all the rest would be NATO members. So they have given a total of 132 billion, and we have given 114 billion. And I'm not saying that we, I'm not passing judgment on how much we've given, but just, please don't go out there and say that the others haven't done their share, because they have. Maybe we all should have done more. All right, getting toward the end now. Here's where we stand in Ukraine today. So on the left-hand side, the red area is generally what Russia has taken over. Crimea, they took over in 2014. They started infiltrating in these provinces. Maybe remember hearing about little green men back in those days. These were Russian operatives, but they didn't have uniforms. So they're pretending just to be, I guess, guys from the neighborhood or something, having a good time. But they're disrupting the government and bombing things, blowing things up, trying to destabilize, the situation. So I guess, clearly, if we have a settlement now that ends the fighting, which obviously I feel would be good, but if you are going to say Russia gets to keep what they have now, this is what they would have. Mainly this red area here. And that's about 20% of Ukraine's territory. And yes, it is true that there are a very significant number of Russian speakers in those areas, Russian ethnic people. That is true. But again, that's true all over Europe. There's hundreds of thousands of Hungarians in Western Romania. And, you know, the list could go on and on. People don't follow these boundaries precisely. But of course, Putin has gone much further and tried to say there's no such thing as Ukrainian nation, that it's always been part of Russia or part of something else. But the Ukrainians obviously feel different. Their language is different. Russian and Ukrainian, look, I don't speak either one. The alphabet is a heck of a challenge. But I am told they are not mutually comprehensible. In other words, just because you speak Ukrainian, you can't just flop around and start speaking Russian or with a Russian. They're different enough that you actually have to learn it. I'm sure they're fairly similar, but you know, so are Spanish and Italian, but they're not, you know, the same by any means. If you go way back in history, 1,000 years, the origins of the Russian nation was indeed called the Kievan Rus, and it was based in the city of what we now know as Kiev. And then it used to be called Kievan Rus. But what does that mean? What is the word Rus? That is actually Old Norse for rower, someone that rows a boat. Now, who do you know from the Norse lands that rowed boats? Vikings. Yep. The Kievan Rus, the first Russian state, was founded by Vikings. And when they came down those rivers and set up their state, they were surrounded by these Slavic tribes. And they incorporated the Slavic tribes into their polity, or the Kievan Rus. And that went on for almost 200 years. So that was the beginning of what we understand as Russia. But then it started to deteriorate, disintegrate into, you know, tribal areas, and then the Mongol hordes came in. The Mongol, who formed the biggest empire geographically in history, and they destroyed all of that. And once the Mongols were finished, that's when Moscow started to emerge. And so then that emerged as a bigger center over a few centuries, and then the Romanovs came in, and, you know, we know the rest of that story. So there are some origins that are shared, but it's the Ukrainian people themselves. And, you know, do we respect self-determination or don't we? And do we respect treaties solemnly agreed to or don't we? Yeah, but to give up 20% of your territory would be very difficult. And I don't see Ukraine agreeing to do that without being allowed to join NATO. Right. And for the very simple reason that, let's say, okay, we want to stop the fighting, Russia, go away, and we won't join NATO. Just leave us alone. What's to stop Putin from rearming, rebuilding the military, and coming right back for more, if there isn't some kind of protection to deter that? So you got to either have one or the other. Either they're allowed to have an actual effective security guarantee, such as NATO membership. Maybe it doesn't have to be that, but there has to be some other actual ironclad guarantee that Russia can't come back. Otherwise, I don't see them ever surrendering their territory. But now we're getting into the discussion area, because I want to hear what you have to think about it. Just quickly, some of you know that kind of to put pressure on Russia in another way, Ukraine actually invaded Russia back in that area of Kursk, where that horrific but effective tank battle took place in the latter part of 1943. I think it was actually July or August of 1943. So the red area, the blue area on this one is what Ukraine controls in that part of Russia. And of course, somebody has said, well, why don't we trade? And I understand Russia is not going to trade that. That's not fair, because they could kick the Ukrainians out of Kursk probably pretty easily if they weren't concentrating so much down here. Crimea, that's a difficult one, because traditionally it is true that Crimea was considered part of Russia. And that only changed in 1954. That's when Khrushchev became chairman of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union after Stalin's death. And he actually was Ukrainian, as was Brezhnev, I learned the other day. But Khrushchev basically said, okay, we're celebrating an anniversary here. Let's give Crimea to Ukraine. And see, the point is, at that time, it didn't really make any difference, because Ukraine was not really sovereign. It was supposed to be an autonomous republic, but that was, of course, a myth. It's all run from Moscow. So it made no actual difference. Oh, we'll just move Crimea into the Ukraine borders. It won't make any difference in how it's run, because we still run it from Moscow, but they get to have the feeling that they have this now. And also the Russian, the Soviet fleet was still anchored. The Black Sea fleet was anchored there. So there was a handover there that, we should know about. But nevertheless, if Russia didn't like that, why didn't they say so at the time of the Budapest Memorandum? Why didn't they drive a harder bargain that time if the Crimea was so important to them? No, they said, we will respect the borders as they are now. Ukraine gives up its nuclear weapons. We won't mess with their territorial integrity as it is today, 1994, not 1953. So they had an opportunity, if they really felt that they had a claim on that, they had an opportunity to press that claim, but no, they decided to just try to take it by force. Casualties. These are hard to pin down, but what I would say is that Russia has paid a huge price for this. So has Ukraine, of course, obviously. But I think Putin, I think most people agree on this, that felt that he would move in easily, carry out a decapitation of the pro-Western government in Kyiv, and put in a puppet government. And he'd had pro-Russian presidents before, and one was just booted out in 2014 before he started to move on Crimea and the Donbass region. But in any event, we now know that it's much more costly. That didn't work. And by the way, I have read recently in this book, which I do recommend, I'm going to say a little bit more about it in a minute, but that it was actually U.S. intelligence that did tip off the Ukrainian government that Moscow was going to invade, and they better get ready. And they were able, because of that, to take steps that prohibited or prevented Putin's forces from carrying out this decapitation that he had planned on to make a relatively painless takeover. So since that failed, and I think the United States deserves some credit for that based on what I have read, over 100,000 dead, maybe as many as 150 or 140,000, and injured 500,000. This is as of, it's hard to get really up-to-date figures or even accurate figures. There's lots of ways they try to figure these things out because Russia doesn't publicize how many deaths they've had. But the one on the right shows the proportion. So these are the low estimate of soldiers killed of 106,000. The high estimate is the larger square. So this is a smaller estimate. This is the larger estimate lost in Ukraine by Russia compared to these other conflicts. So this was Chechnya back in 99 through 2009, Afghanistan back in the 80s, and the earlier incursions into Ukraine here. So you can see they've lost way more than in all of those put together by far. So it has been very costly. Is that enough to deter them? Well, again, this is the equipment lost. So thousands of over 3,000 tanks lost, 4,000 mobility vehicles, armored vehicles, and so on. So they've also lost a lot of equipment. Sanctions. Now, these are the new sanctions since the invasion. So you can see there's a lot of them. Thousands, tens of thousands. Is it having an impact? The blue line indicates estimated Russian GDP without the sanctions. Red line indicates actual. So it has cost them, again, it looks like about 6 or 7% of their GDP potential growth. And I have seen estimates by economists that that's about the impact that it's had on the average Russian's take-home pay. NATO is bulking up the eastern flank. I don't have time to go through all the numbers, but they're definitely committing more troops from all the different member countries into all those areas. They had a military operation last year called Steadfast Defender and used over 80 aircraft, 50 ships, 1,000 combat vehicles, and 90,000 troops carried out exercises and war games in Eastern Europe just to show readiness. This is probably the biggest possibility for the next conflict, the Suwalki Gap here. So again, remember I mentioned out right at the beginning, after World War II, the Soviet Union got this area called Kaliningrad, it used to be called Königsberg, of East Prussia. And they have held on to that. You know, I had a thought, I'll just share this with you, maybe it's a bad idea, but as soon as that full-scale invasion took place in 2002, I said, why don't we blockade Kaliningrad? Well, I think it was because they were afraid that that would provoke a major war. And they're still trying to keep it somewhat contained. Also, blockades don't work that well, so it probably isn't that a good idea. What I am told is, and I have not been to this place, but I've told it's one big military base. They have just loaded it up with weapons, rockets, tanks, everything you can think of, artillery. But this is probably what they would try to do. We would choke this area off, which is only, I think, 120 miles, something like that. And then move in through Belarus and Russia. There's no doubt in my mind that if Putin really, again, is planning to continue his aggression, that the Baltic states will probably be next. Because of when the Soviet Union had that area within the Soviet Union for 45 years, they moved a lot of Russians in there because they're trying to Russify it, make it more controllable by them. And when these countries got in their independence in 1991, they did pass some laws that discriminated against the Russians. They didn't give them full voting rights and things of that nature. So there would be a complaint there, and there would be we're rescuing the poor, beleaguered, and discriminated against Russians. Which again does not carry water, because again you could justify that all over the place in Europe and even elsewhere. But it doesn't matter. I mean, if his attitude persists that he has had up till now, he doesn't care, what the laws are, what treaties say, or what he has promised or his government has promised earlier. So that is the most vulnerable area, I would say. Now that's why from Putin's viewpoint, I think an unintended consequence of his full-scale invasion was to prod both Sweden and Finland, which had been previously neutral, into joining NATO. And they are right there. And so he's strategically a lot worse off than he was before Sweden and Finland joined NATO. And they joined NATO because of the threat that he showed them that he was by invading Ukraine. So that one backfired on him. Again, attacks, this is 2044. I know that's a long way off. The only reason I show this is that we also have to take into account, we're getting into new areas of combat. So here they're saying they might have in 44 AI-controlled tanks invade the Baltic countries. We have nuclear-armed Iran and North Korea in support. Troops take that Suwalki Gap. Hackers hit transport links. Missiles hit civilian targets in Europe. And they try to cut off the newly formed Arctic route. So keep in mind, cyber warfare is important. Drones, all these things are new in the realm of combat and have to be taken into account. Just last year, US and Germany agreed to deploy intermediate range ballistic missiles in Germany. These have been pulled out decades ago. Now they're going back in. And this is to have a credible intermediate range ballistic missile, nuclear or conventional, on Russia that can easily reach European Russia. Conclusions. All right, given the ideological shifts and other uncertainties in U.S. politics, U.S. leadership of NATO can no longer be taken for granted. U.S. indifference or even hostility toward the European powers will require bold and concerted action on their part. Although NATO expansion may have influenced Russia's invasion of Ukraine, Russia's action has solidified, expanded, and reinforced Europe's commitment to collective security. So that's with the addition of Sweden and Finland and some of the other recent additions. And it's not just that. There's countries that in Europe that are not in NATO now that would very strongly contribute to a European defense force if that's what they decide they have to do, if they can't count on the United States anymore. But also, you know, it's a much more difficult time now. It was a lot easier in the 90s. That's when some authors could even talk about the end of history, right? Western liberal capitalism has won the contest, and there's no real fascism is discredited, communism is discredited. Everybody will become liberal and prosperous, and everything will be fine. But, you know, that's a little bit too utopian. So we have to take another look. But I do believe, as I've tried to show you, the capability to deter aggression and therefore to protect European security, the ability to do that is there. But the political will to use it is what is in question. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, so there is definitely a lot to unpack here. Thank you, Professor Farrell, for that wonderful lecture. Now, just remember one question until everyone has asked the questions that they want. So don't load it up with a 4-question question. Professor Farrell, even though he's more than capable of answering such a thing. Just one at a time. Emily will be working the left-hand side of the room. I'll be working the right-hand side of the room and online. So we have someone right there. So
there's someone in the back as well.
Yep.
So, assuming that the United States, at least in name, stays a part of NATO, What would be the NATO response if the United States becomes an aggressor, for instance, decides it's going to take over Greenland?
No, I think that would destroy the organization.
Yeah.
Because that would be one member attacking the other member. Not only not defending that other member, but actually attacking. So that would destroy it for sure. Now, I think that's kind of unlikely, but what I do worry about here is, and maybe I'm wrong about this, but remember I stressed that peace and avoiding World War III really requires respecting existing borders. And when we have a leader of the United States that apparently doesn't respect borders, what is that going to lead to? I think there's a fundamental lack of understanding or not caring about how to prevent extremely destructive conflict and learning the lessons of the horrible first half of the 20th century. Now I know, okay, that's a long time ago. But if you don't learn from history, there's plenty of sayings about that. But yeah, I guess I'm afraid of that. And I'm afraid of even more serious things. You know, what if the United States, instead of combating the evil empire, as I believe George Bush referred to, what if we become part of the evil empire?
Yep.
Is it totally unthinkable
No.
to think that
He likes oligarchs.
the United States might actually abandon our previous allies and join up with Russia
Yep.
and make a deal with China
And get in.
and say, we're the biggest and most powerful countries, we'll just divvy up the world. So I'll take Greenland and all of the Americas, and you, Russia, can have Europe, and China, you can have all of Asia. See, that's an abandonment of obviously principles that we thought were established. That's going back to might is right, imperialism, things I thought we had moved beyond and learned were not right, and did not contribute to peace, contributed to war. You know, the European countries didn't give up their colonial empires just because they one day woke up with a bad conscience. People had to fight and die in many places. Sometimes they fought nonviolently, like in India. And unfortunately, other places it was violent. But that's what it took. And it would happen again. And again, I'll just tell you off top, I'm sorry I'm running off, but I have many students from Panama in my classes because we traditionally had a Panamanian contingent at Ripon College. And one of my former students is currently the ambassador of Panama to the United States. And he's a former foreign minister of Panama. And I have not talked to him specifically about this, but I am sure from knowing him and communications that we've had over the years, if somebody comes in to try to take the Panama Canal, they will fight for it. Now, can the U.S. Army defeat the Panamanian Army? Of course. But at what cost? Is that something you really want to see? They're not going to give that up without that. I can assure you of that. So, where is all this going?
The question that was in the back of the room was, could you say the title of the book once again?
Yeah, I'm sorry. So this is a book by Richard Rose, R-O-S-E. He's a long-standing political scientist. He was born in the United States, but made his career mainly in Scotland, I believe. But he's extremely well-known political scientist. Been around for years. In fact, I looked this up. He's 91 years old. And this is like his 30th or so book. It's called European Security from Ukraine to Washington. And it's by what press? Bloomsbury Academic. So this is brand new. I just got this last week because I'm asked to review this for the American Library Association. I review several books a year, and then every library gets recommendations on books to buy. But I will be recommending this one strongly for all levels. If I were teaching international relations or national security policy, I would definitely use this book. He gives you, again, it's only 160 pages, but gives an overview of European security since the end of World War II, but right up to today. He has a lot of insights on the conflict in Ukraine and has a lot of thoughtful ideas about, he doesn't know how to end it because for the reasons we've discussed. It's pretty hard to, agree. If Russia's not going to agree to anything that gives Ukraine a security lifeline, then Ukraine can't agree to what they want. So anyway, he looks through all that. I would recommend it. You can't go wrong. It's not only good in content, but it's readable. I could barely put it down once I started. So, yeah.
Professor, thank you very much for the excellent lecture. NATO currently is not in Ukraine, right?
Correct.
Okay. Does the United States have the ability to send NATO troops in there without the other NATO countries agreeing?
No.
And Trump's talking about that today. It's possible.
What?
False. There's a news story about that potential thing happening. So you
Okay.
agree so the way NATO's constructed, that
No.
generals.
No. And I won't read it again, but I read you that Article 5, that what the NATO countries are pledged to is to consider an attack on one an attack on all. But this hasn't been an attack on one. This hasn't been an attack on a NATO member. But even if it were, each member still decides how to respond to it individually. But they have to commit their troops because they are their troops. As I said, there's only 2,000 full-time employees of NATO per se. The way NATO has combat forces is they're contributed by the member nations. And that's why you have these commanders, they coordinate that. So they say, okay, Denmark, you'll give us this and this and this, and Sweden, you'll give us this, this, and this, and Greece will give us this, this, and this. And they coordinate it. But no, it's the individual countries decide what and how many and in what capacity they will contribute. So I have not seen this yet. I do not know how that would be. No, the U.S. president cannot order around the troops of any other country. No.
And one over there.
Professor, thank you very much for your discussion. It was very informative. I think you paint a rosier picture than I do of the situation, believe it or not.
Oh, no.
Because, what are your thoughts, Professor, on the dimension with respect to the NATO countries themselves and the integrity of the democratic institutions there and their continued willingness to support? I think a lot of the arguments presented today assume an integrated European component of NATO. But we see illiberal democracies in Orban in Hungary, even in some of the original NATO countries like Italy. Do you see this as another column of risk? And would our current president, I think our current president would be more than willing to become transactional with illiberal governments in these countries to jeopardize NATO even further?
Do I need to repeat the question? No, he's on the microphone, right? Okay, I know I'm talking about this is being viewed elsewhere. And by the way, I learned you can view these after the fact too. So last week I found them on YouTube and I watched some of the previous ones. They did a very good job, Beth and Pablo, gentlemen, both from Beloit. No, that's a very good point. And, again, I'm afraid of that too. Poland had an illiberal government there for several years, Law and Justice, but they were voted out. But I would say in that case, Poland is so traumatized by Russia that you don't have to do much convincing to any of them to stand up to Russia. But Hungary, on the other hand, and Orban, that's really, he's very friendly with Putin. And this is that unholy alliance that I'm afraid of really deeply. Frankly, our president, unfortunately, I hope I'm wrong about this, but actually teaming up with Putin and Orban and the AfD. And we had this speech by Vice President Vance just last week, in which he said, I'm not afraid of Russia in Europe. I'm not afraid of China. I'm afraid of you folks depriving neo-Nazis of their free speech. So you're right in that sense. Hungary so far hasn't raised too much havoc within NATO. And they've allowed, because they had to, it has to be unanimous to admit a new member. And they voted, it took some arm twisting, but they approved Sweden, which was the last one to go in. Because I think Hungary also has, even the more conservative people voting for Orban did not like being under the Soviet domination for 45 years. And Soviet isn't exactly Russian, but it's kind of the same. And so I think there's enough anti-Russian feeling there to keep it going. But you certainly raise a very important consideration. And we even have a far-right party in the government in the Netherlands, which we didn't anticipate. But that is a definite thing. It's, again, we thought in the 90s that we had all those things solved. The extremes of both left and right, we don't have to worry about anymore. But unfortunately, there's various insecurities that have arisen. I will agree that in all of the cases that the immigration issues were mishandled. And that's even was the main reason for the Brexit vote in the United Kingdom. And it wasn't immigrants from Africa or the Middle East. It was from other EU countries. So I agree. There's some real issues there. That's all I could say right now. Yep. Okay.
Well, you probably know that there are too many voices that they are saying the opposite about Russian aggression. Well, yeah, it's true, invaded Ukraine. Too many voices that say that the reckless expansion of NATO to the east, and then the government of Ukraine that was elected legitimate government in 2014, that was overthrown by the U.S. government. You had this woman of the State Department, Virginia Nolan. You could hear it giving instruction to the plotters and installing this sort of fascistic government in Kiev. Now what you were saying about the Russians infiltrating Eastern Ukraine, the reality is that Ukrainians have been ethnic cleansing ethnic Russians. Putin said to stop. Now, what you said that NATO never invaded countries, United States is a member of NATO. I can quote Vietnam, and then NATO, I can quote Syria, Libya, Iraq. These are countries that were invaded by NATO, and in Syria, for example, that the U.S. military was plundering the oil. Now, I heard a number that is just chilling this war on terror that started in 2001, 2003. And NATO has killed estimated 4.5 million people. I mean, these numbers are chilling about NATO,
All right, well, you've raised a number of points, and I respect your point of view. I'm not going to sit here and try to, refute them point by point. I think in the case of Libya, the country was collapsing, and it was an effort to try to bring stability. And it ended up with Gaddafi being overthrown and killed. But unfortunately, the result wasn't a good, stable outcome.
They make it unstable.
That was at the time, though, there were uprisings in almost all the Arab dictatorships. So that was all part of really kind of a movement in many of those countries. Syria, I'm more in agreement with you that was a big mistake, because finally, Bashar Assad is now gone, but that's over 10 years after we did try to intervene there and help his opponents. And I agree with you, that was misguided. So, or certainly it didn't work out as intended. So certainly nobody is perfect, but I think there's an overwhelming consensus that what Russia has been doing, especially with this most recent all-out invasion of one nation state by another, has not been done in other cases, and definitely not by NATO. Now, the United States, believe me, we made mistakes. But who was it that insisted on invading Iraq? It was the so-called Vulcans, very conservative national defense hawks. And so if it was a mistake, why do we keep voting for the same kind of people? Similarly with the, I know I'm maybe drifting here, but the financial collapse of 2007, 2008, which was a disaster. And a lot of people are pointing, that's something to undermine respect for government and authority and economists, for that matter, even more seriously. But what caused that? Excessive deregulation of the financial industry. They allowed them to create all these new instruments that weren't backed up properly. They hired mathematicians to invent new investment instruments that even the financial planners didn't understand. And they ended up collapsing and costing us billions, if not trillions of dollars. There was excessive deregulation led by people like Phil Grant. But who are we voting for now? People that want deregulation. Got to have more and more deregulation. So I agree with you. We haven't learned from our own past mistakes anywhere nearly the way we should. And we have made too many mistakes. The mistakes we have made does not justify Vladimir Putin invading a sovereign country that his country had taken a solemn pledge to leave alone. Okay, anything else?
Just one last question sorry. There's a lot to worry about and a lot to imagine, but as just a citizen that's concerned about our democracy, and other than my vote, what can a concerned citizen do? What can we get involved in? What can we do to interject common sense and goodness into this?
I wish I knew, believe me. I ask myself the same thing.
Join the League.
And I'm disappointed.
That was
Would you like to comment?
It was him.
I'm sorry. I just said you can join the League of Women Voters.
Okay, that's a good start. And I want to tell you that actually, I haven't mentioned this, I don't think, but I am a member of the League of Women Voters of the greater Ripon area. Thank you. Yeah, I've been quite active, especially since I retired, from teaching and the county board. I have more time. So I'm very disappointed with some of the directions as a citizen. I'm even more disappointed as an educator. I've been out there 44 years trying to teach people about our Constitution, our government, our checks and balances, the rule of law. I just learned another one today. I have 7 former students that are judges in Wisconsin or Minnesota. So I have tried. And then I see patent falsehoods being peddled and swallowed, left and right, constantly. It's very frustrating. And I'm not going to tell you to take to the streets because at my age, I'm not going to go out, probably take to the streets too much. But I wish I knew. Just have to keep plugging away. Try to tell the truth as you see it. When we're talking with, I know this can be hard, family, friends, neighbors, maybe we try to avoid it, but I think there are ways to talk about things that are civil and maybe get them to think a little bit. But other than that, I do not, I wish I knew because it's frustrating as an educator. When you think that a student, the first thing they would learn in Econ 101, if I remember this, because I took quite a bit of economics. My degree is political science, but a tariff is a tax. A tariff is a tax on an import. That's the first thing you learn in Econ 101. But in the public sector, that's not understood. Somehow foreigners pay tariffs? No, they don't. It's a tax on an import. That's the first thing you learn. So, I don't know, try to educate. That's the best I can come up with. Okay? All right. Well, thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Professor Farrell, hope you can join us next week for another, I'm sure to be interesting conversation and lecture, International Cooperation on Climate Change, with Professor Elizabeth Week of UWGB. Thank you so much for braving the cold and coming out tonight. We'll see you next week.
And don't forget the book tomorrow. Okay.